in London. Thank you so much to the organisers for having me and inviting me. I really, really appreciate it. So, just to give you a bit of a heads up before I start, given the nature of the topic, there will be like references to sexually explicit content, there will be some swearing, and there'll also be some references to like sexual assault and non-consensual sex. I'll do my best to give you a heads up like before those things happen. So if you want, like feel free to dip in and out. Okay, so I'd like to start by getting you to think about sexual consent. And in particular, I'd like you to think about sexual consent in relation to alcohol and other drugs. What kind of is said about consent and alcohol and drugs? Like what kind of messages are out there? There are already quite a few messages out there, and I'm going to show you some of them now. And the ones I'm going to show you, they're going to be in poster form. So this is the first one. If she's drunk, she legally can't consent. Sex without consent is rape. And this one, consent doesn't equal drunk. Consent equals a sincere and sober yes. And this one, are they affected by alcohol or drugs? Then they can't consent to sex or anything sexual. So based on those messages, we might want to ask the question, is all sex involving alcohol and drugs non-consensual? And if we're in agreement with messages like these, then we might have to assume yes. But there are also, what is it about alcohol and drugs that is so problematic for consent? And just a bit of a heads up, I'm going to stop saying alcohol and drugs now, and I'm just going to say drugs, and I'm including alcohol in that category. So to answer that question, we're going to have to dig a little bit deeper into what consent actually means. So this is the definition of consent in the Sexual Offences Act, which applies to England and Wales. A person consents if they agree by choice and have the freedom and capacity to make that choice. So just to draw your attention to the mention of capacity there, because that's really where drugs become important. So what does it mean to have the capacity to consent to sex? Well, to answer that question, we can look to the Mental Capacity Act. Again, this applies to England and Wales. So the first point is that everyone kind of starts out with capacity. It's assumed that everyone has the capacity to consent to sex, unless it's established officially that you lack capacity. So in order to establish whether a person lacks capacity, the Act has this to say. A person lacks capacity in relation to a matter if at the material time they are unable to make a decision for themselves in relation to the matter because of an impairment of or a disturbance in the functioning of the mind or brain, whether permanent or temporary. So obviously that is quite a wordy definition. So it's just to highlight the important points there. It's being unable to make a decision because of some kind of impairment. And when we're thinking about impairment in relation to drugs, that impairment is going to be temporary because the idea is once the effects of the drugs wear off, the person will no longer be impaired. So what does this definition of capacity mean for sex on drugs? Well, if we're going to listen to messages like these, then we would probably say, well, don't have sex on drugs. You can't have sex on drugs, not even a little bit. You can only have sex when you're sober. But obviously that's a bit problematic because, you know, as we all know, a lot of people have sex on drugs, like maybe some of us here have sex on drugs. And just telling people not to do it isn't really necessarily going to be effective, especially when, you know, drugs are illegal. We tell people not to take drugs and people still take drugs. So it's a bit too simplistic of a message, but there are also other messages out there as well. So these other messages, they come from various different organizations, but some of the most common are university websites, and in particular American university websites like these ones here. Sexual health charities and organizations. These are two in the UK who kind of give messaging around sex on drugs. And finally, you'll find it from kind of young people's online news websites, The Mix being one of those. They also give advice about sex and drugs. So just to give you a bit of a flavour of the kinds of other messages that are out there other than don't do it, I'm going to give you an example from Dartmouth Uni, because yeah, they give some of the most detailed information that I've seen. So Dartmouth says, while it is possible to have consenting positive sexual interactions while using alcohol or drugs, there's a lot to consider. And what we need to consider, according to Dartmouth, is they impair our judgment, they affect our capacity to communicate, and they impact our ability to read and interpret others' communication. So Dartmouth also, on top of this, gives us some information about when it is not okay to have sex with someone who is on drugs. And this is what they say. Consent cannot be given by a person who is incapacitated. Therefore, it is imperative to be able to determine the difference between incapacitation and intoxication. Incapacitation is a state beyond drunkenness or intoxication. So the kind of most important point here being that intoxication and incapacitation are two separate and distinct states. And while an intoxicated person might have the capacity to consent to sex, an incapacitated person definitely doesn't. So based on the information provided by Dartmouth and on the information provided by the other organisations I mentioned as well, we can infer this kind of scale where we have a sober person on one end who definitely does have the capacity to consent. We have an incapacitated person on the other who definitely does not have the capacity to consent. But then we've got this more kind of vague grey area in the middle where you're kind of intoxicated, you're kind of getting more intoxicated, and it's not very clear whether or not you have the capacity to consent here. So maybe if you're kind of here, then it's okay. Yes, you do have capacity. But if you're here, then maybe it's not okay. You maybe don't have capacity anymore. But no one can really say where on this line it becomes not okay. We also see this idea of impairment coming through from Dartmouth. This idea that intoxication, it can, to some extent at least, be considered synonymous with impairment, like intoxication and impairment are almost the same thing. So we can see, you know, alcohol and drugs, they impair our judgment, they affect our capacity to communicate. And, you know, we're going to assume they mean affect in a negative way. I think it's unlikely they mean it's going to affect it in a positive way. And same for impacting our ability to read and interpret others' communication. So yeah, this idea of impairment coming through. But I think what's really important about this impairment talk is that it implies a sober person, because they're not on drugs, their judgment, their capacity to communicate, and their ability to read and interpret others' communication is at some kind of flawless level. But is this actually true? You know, what if someone was extremely angry or extremely jealous or anxious? Like, could that not impair our judgment in some way? Or, you know, what if you just didn't have that much sleep last night? Might that affect your capacity to communicate? Or, you know, what if you're neurodiverse? Might that impact your ability to read and interpret others' communication? So basically what I'm trying to say is sobriety is just not a consistent state to be in. And that's not even to mention the kinds of substances that we're consuming on a day-to-day basis anyway, like coffee or paracetamol or the contraceptive pill or antidepressants, things that don't really get classed as a drug in the same way as things like MDMA or cannabis, but are still having an effect on our physical and mental states. So going back to the scale, I talked before about sobriety and incapacitated states as being uncomplicated in terms of judging whether someone has capacity, and the middle bit is where it's complicated. But actually we've just kind of problematized sobriety a little bit there. So now I want to problematize incapacity a little bit as well. So how do we know if someone is incapacitated? What does incapacity look like? Again, let's go back to Dartmouth Uni because they provide some advice on this exact thing. So they say, an individual who is incapacitated lacks the ability to make informed judgments and cannot consent to sexual contact. Incapacitation is the inability, temporarily or permanently, to give consent because an individual is mentally and or physically helpless, asleep, unconscious, or unaware that sexual activity is occurring. So we've got these, oh, well, first off, actually, what's interesting about this definition is that it really reflects that definition that we talked about at the beginning in the Mental Capacity Act. And it is true that kind of organizations like these, universities, the sexual health charities, the news websites, they really do frame their advice in legal terms. It often really reflects the law. So that's kind of the first thing to know. But yeah, what does incapacity look like? So this definition, it's given us some quite concrete things to look for. We've got asleep, unconscious. But then we've got, well, you know, I'm saying concrete. I'm saying, like, I think people would broadly agree what an asleep person looks like and what an unconscious person looks like. Maybe there'd be some disagreement, but I think broadly we'd agree. But then we've got these less concrete or more ambiguous things like mentally and or physically helpless, or unaware that sexual activity is occurring. Like, what do these look like? How do we look for this? You know, I think there's likely to be some disagreement here, and people are going to kind of have different standards here about, you know, whether someone would meet this criteria or not. But going back to these more concrete things, asleep or unconscious, I kind of want to question, is it actually the case that everyone agrees that sex with an unconscious person or sex with an asleep person counts as sexual assault? So to question this, what I want to do is talk about quite a famous sexual assault case that happened in the US in 2012 in a town called Steubenville. So I'm just going to talk about that a little bit now, just as a heads up. And I'm also going to show a picture of the victim as well. So just a heads up for that as well. So I don't want to go on too much about the case, but basically there was a teenage girl. She'd attended a party with her classmates. She drank a lot. She drank to the point of unconsciousness, and two of her male classmates assaulted her. And she was held by some people, not everyone, but she was held quite to some extent responsible for what had happened to her, given her decision to drink to that extent. And there were actually pictures going around the internet like this one of her unconscious body being dragged around by these boys, you know, like clearly kind of meeting the criteria of unconsciousness. In fact, like one of the kind of other party attendees described her as looking like a corpse. But even with this kind of photo evidence, her incapacity wasn't really enough to hold her blameless for what had happened. She was still being held responsible for what happened. So obviously there's a lot to say here about, you know, victim blaming and women's bodies, and also the particularly harsh judgment that women and girls get for their drug use. You know, the boys who assaulted her, they were drinking as well. But, you know, they weren't judged in the same way as she was. You know, they actually attracted a lot of sympathy because, you know, people were saying it's going to ruin their careers, it's going to ruin their football careers, it's so sad for them, that kind of thing. So different kind of standards there. But I'm not going to go too much into this because I want to start sharing some of my own data soon. So this is kind of where we're at, like, in terms of how capacity is constructed through law and through policy, like those university policies, websites and information they were giving. We've got these concepts: sobriety, impairment, intoxication, incapacitation, and it's not super clear just how well these can actually work when we apply them to real life situations. It's just much less clear cut when we're talking about people's lived experiences of sex. I also think this scale, it reflects a tendency to think about intoxication only in relation to alcohol, but to also try and apply the same advice to other drugs as well. So, you know, this scale, it does make a bit more sense when we think about it in relation to alcohol, because, you know, when you drink alcohol, you can start to slur your words, stumble around. If you drink so much, like, you might pass out. So we can kind of see this scale making a little bit of sense, at least in relation to alcohol. But does it make as much sense in relation to other drugs? So thinking about a stimulant drug like cocaine, for example, does this scale make as much sense for that drug? Especially when we talk about cocaine, sometimes people talk about cocaine as sobering them up from the effects of alcohol. So this scale just doesn't really make as much sense. And then maybe, I don't know, thinking about the scale in relation to psychedelic drugs as well. You know, again, does it make as much sense? So when I'm saying I'm researching sex on drugs, I'm being quite loose with what I'm classing as a drug. You know, I said before I'm classing alcohol as a drug, but it's even more loose than that actually, because I'm trying to leave it up to my participants to decide what they think is a drug or not. So, you know, for the most part, the kinds of drugs that they talk about having sex on are things like MDMA, cocaine, cannabis, 2CB, GHB. But then I've also got a participant who talks about being on testosterone and talks about how like testosterone has been affecting their body and been affecting sex for them. And I've also got a participant who talks about being on the contraceptive pill and how that affects sex for them. So I'm just trying to be quite loose in what I am classing as a drug. Another thing I want to do is move away from this idea that sobriety is somehow like this ideal state to be making decisions, that it's better than any drug altered state just because of the absence of drugs. So I really, really want to move beyond that idea, just assuming it. I don't want to assume that sobriety is better, because then just no drug altered state could ever measure up if sobriety is always and automatically better. And the final thing I want to do is really kind of reject the idea that taking a drug will have a predetermined effect on the sexual experience. So, you know, whether that be an impairing effect, like we've already talked about, or something else. Because, you know, I've often found that when talking to people about sex on drugs, people can be really quick to make links between taking a drug and wanting to have sex, almost as if like the chemical makeup of the drug itself like activates a desire for sex in someone. And what I'm saying is just that, you know, that desire for sex, it doesn't happen devoid of context. You know, it's connected to, you know, who else is around you, where you are, what your material surroundings are, what kind of mood you're in, all things like that. So there's just more to it than taking the drug. So I really want to reject this idea. So the goal really is to decenter the person who's using the drug and decenter the drug itself, and instead kind of acknowledge all of the things that are going on when people are using drugs and having sex. So these are some examples of things that I put in the slides are, you know, like space or place, time, technology, other people, other drugs, but there are countless other things that could be relevant as well. These are just, you know, a very small amount of some examples that could be relevant. So in order to think about all these factors when thinking about sex on drugs, what is really useful to do is to think about the sex on drug event as the unit of analysis. So instead of the drug user or the drug as the unit of analysis, taking the event as the unit of analysis. And that enables you to kind of hold all those things together in your head at the same time. Also, this is where I less remember what my notes were. So just like fingers crossed for the next bit. So just to say, my thinking about sex on drugs in this way, in terms of events, is really inspired by a lot of other academics before me who are often classed as like critical drugs researchers. So just off the top of my head, these people like Faye Dennis, Cameron Duff, Kane Race, Ella Dilks-Frayne, and many, many more. That's not an exhaustive list at all. And they in turn are inspired by new materialist and post-humanist theories. And these approaches, these theoretical approaches to kind of understanding social phenomena, whether that be people using drugs, is really, again, that idea of decentering the human and also capturing the relationality between different aspects of the drug using event, whether that be, you know, people, places, objects, drugs, technologies, etc., etc., etc. So what does all this mean for what I've been saying about capacity? Well, the main thing I want to do following that idea of decentering the human, is no longer think about capacity only in relation to people. So in order to do that, I'm kind of broadening out the idea of capacity to this idea of affective capacity, which just very simply means the capacity to affect and to be affected. So, you know, to affect things that are going on around you and also to be affected by them. So obviously, you know, people do have affective capacity. I'm not saying that people don't, but, you know, drugs have affective capacities. Spaces and places have affective capacities. Objects do, you know, the list goes on. I think there was more I needed to say here, but I may need to just stop to remember. Okay, yes, I remember. So I'm aware that what I'm talking about right now does feel quite abstract. So what I'd like to do is actually ground it in some data, some actual data, so you can kind of see more what I'm actually talking about. So I will share with you some data. And before I do that, I just want to let you know a tiny little bit about my data collection methods. So I've used 3 different methods. The first is observation. The second is participant diaries, and the third is in-depth interviews. So the observation component involved me going to online sex parties, actually via Zoom as well. And yeah, there was lots of drug use happening in those parties, so there was also lots of sex and drugs happening in those parties. And I've got about 25 participants who are keeping diaries about their sex on drug experiences, and they do that for about a 3-month period. And then when they return their diaries, I do an interview with them based on their diaries. So yeah, I'm going to present to you data from one particular participant who I'm going to use as a kind of case study to explore this idea of affective capacities in more detail and kind of show you what it looks like in practice. Again, I'm just going to check what I needed to say. Okay, cool. So the participant story that I'm going to share with you is called Pan, obviously not their real name, but their name for the purposes of this project. They are 29 years old, identify as queer and non-binary, and are happy with any of the pronoun options, whether it be they, she, or him. So Pan wrote about a number of sexual experiences they had with one particular person who they referred to as fuckboy. And this is probably a good time to tell you that the following description is very sexually explicit and will contain a lot of swearing. So, you know, if you're not comfortable with that, feel free to dip out. I also wanted to just go through a little bit of terminology that Pan uses in their story before I share the story with you. So Pan refers to chemsex. So chemsex is kind of usefully thought about as like a specific subsection of sex on drugs, like a specific sex on drug type. So usually it refers to men who have sex with other men using 3 specific drugs, which are crystal methamphetamine, methadone, and GHB or GBL, to have sex. Usually for extended periods of time and often in group settings as well, so group sex. They also refer to slamming, which in chemsex context means injecting, so injecting drugs. Pan refers to a number of drugs in their story, but sometimes they just refer to them by different names. So when they say G, that means GHB or GBL. And they refer to cannabis quite a lot as well, but I don't think they actually say cannabis. They just refer to getting stoned or smoking joints. Then the last thing, they refer to prepping or douching, which is flushing your rectum with water in preparation for anal sex. Cool. So I'm sure many of you already knew those definitions anyway, but just in case. Okay, so moving on to Pan's story. So this is basically in Pan's own words. I've edited it a little bit for clarity and just to kind of keep to time, but what you're hearing is in Pan's own words. So Pan says, I met fuckboy at some point last year at a chemsex party. I made my way to a previous partner's place, lured over by a photo sent on Grindr. Fuckboy was gorgeous and the kind of guy I would never pull on Grindr. He might protest that, but I doubt he would have responded to my messages. Anyway, at our first meeting, we were massively off our tits. I can't remember what I had prior to arriving there, but while there, we had crystal meth, GHB, and Viagra, definitely. I recall us getting on and getting off with each other quite well. I was more interested in having sex with him than the host. Eventually, we called it quits as a threesome, and Fuckboy and I went back to his. We hadn't intended to when we set off, but looking back, it was probably a bit inevitable. We went back to his house and got really quite stoned. I smoked 3 joints back to back to kill any come down. It's a tried and tested method, and it resulted in a few hours of intense but quite wonderful sex. Months later, we interacted on WhatsApp again. We agreed a time to meet when his flatmate would be away. We discussed taking G at some point in the conversation, so I got some in preparation for our meeting. The conversation we had around G, I think, ended with us saying that although we'd quite like to take it and have sex, we probably shouldn't. He was trying to be good because he'd recently gone on quite a heavy chemsex bender. He revealed to me later that he'd slammed a couple of times on the bender. Anyways, I just got some G in case, and I wasn't sure I'd even take it with me, given how our conversation had ended. I was happy to have sex with him just stoned, but I also enjoy sex on G, so why not? When it finally came time to head over, I waffled quite a bit as to whether to bring the G with me. He'd said that he wasn't into it, but I had a sinking suspicion that he'd change his mind, so I brought it. I had one bag that I put the drugs in and another that I filled with lube and cock rings. I arrived, we got stoned, and basically got straight into it. I think this might have been his first sex since the aforementioned chemsex bender. We went very quickly to penetrative sex, with him pounding me. We'd previously discussed taking it slow since I hadn't been fucked in a while, but that didn't really happen. He hadn't even finished prepping for me to fuck him. I made moves to fuck him, but he shied away because of problems douching. Typical. I recall being mid-coitus with him inside me, and the fact that I'd brought G came into conversation. He was really down for it while he was fucking me. I believe he talked about how slutty it would make him or us. Then he came. We rolled off each other and had something to drink. I suggested we have a shot of G, and surprisingly, given that he'd been down for it 5 minutes ago, he declined. It was weird. It wasn't weird enough to not have another few goes at it. I think the G might have come up again during the second or third round. We didn't end up taking any at any point, however. So there's so many things to say about Pan's story. I could probably talk about it all day, but for now, what I want to do is use the story to show how use the story to show how the ways that Pan was affected by drugs really only came about through the events that Pan was using the drugs in. So, to start, Pan talks about going to a previous partner's place for this chemsex party. And it's interesting that kind of only in relation to this host, this previous partner, Pan realizes, actually, I'm more interested in having sex with this new person, fuckboy, than the host. Like I said, Pan also refers to it being a chemsex party, which is obviously associated with those certain drugs I talked about, some of which Pan did actually go on to take. They had crystal meth, they had GHB, and they had Viagra as well. Pan talks about them kind of trying to have a threesome, and it sounds like maybe it didn't go very well, maybe it didn't last very long, but whatever the reason, they decided to stop, and Pan went back to Fuckboy's place. And then what's interesting is Pan starts to describe using weed or cannabis really as a tool to get rid of or remove any kind of come down that they could have experienced after having taken those other drugs at the chemsex party. So, and that for Pan results in using weed in that way results in this really intense and wonderful sex. So to understand the effects of weed there, we really have to think about it in terms of the event. other aspects of the event, the fact that Pan had been to that chemsex party, the fact that the other person was there as well, the time that had elapsed since taking those other drugs and leaving, all of those played into what the effects of weed were for Pan in that situation at that particular time. We then transition to Pan and Fuckboy arranging their second meeting, which they do via WhatsApp. And here they kind of, before the meeting, talk about whether or not they're going to take G and have sex. And the way Pan describes it, there's some ambivalence. So it sounds like they both kind of want to do it, but Fuckboy is a bit reluctant. He feels like maybe he shouldn't. So that kind of results in this, back and forth for Pan over whether they should actually take the G with them at all. Like, if Fuckboy's not up for it, should they even take it with them? In the end, they decide they will bring it, but they're not actually sure if they'll use it or not. So then onto the sex itself. So first I want to draw your attention to the really quite small role that weed seems to play in this situation, particularly in comparison to the last one. In the last one, weed played a really key role in like calming Pan down, getting them into this bodily state where they could enjoy this really intense and wonderful sex. Whereas in this one, I arrived, we got stoned, we got into it. Weed gets a passing mention. It just doesn't really seem to be relevant in the same way. So again, that's really showing how the effects of weed, they emerge through events. We can't predetermine what they're going to be. So next we move on to this really interesting moment where during sex, Pan and Fuckboy start talking about G and the fact that Pan had brought the G with them. Okay, I don't think I highlighted anything else. Okay, so they talk about having the G with them. And what's really interesting is this conversation, only this conversation about this drug seems to affect the sex. Fuckboy talks about how slutty it would make him or them to take it. It seems to really turn him on, this conversation about the G. Then he comes and they stop having sex and Pan says, do you want to have the G? And then Fuckboy's like, oh, no, I don't want to. So what's really interesting there is the effect that G had in that situation without it even being consumed. Neither of them even took it, yet it still played this role in the sex they were having. He talked about being slutty, this, that. It had an effect on the sex, but it wasn't even taken. And again, to understand the effect that G had there, we need to think about it in relation to events. So Pan talks about how, this was Fuckboy's potentially first sexual situation after having a chemsex bender. And, this event in relation to that previous event could have affected their decision not to take it and feeling like they shouldn't have taken it. We've also got this really interesting positioning of G as being like especially deviant or especially naughty. And that's really striking particularly in relation to the way weed is talked about. When Pan describes them smoking weed together, it just doesn't seem like a big deal at all. Whereas when G comes into the conversation, it's got all these connotations of being slutty and bad and wrong. So it's quite interesting how G is talked about in that situation. And that really reflects how G is talked about more widely. Again, we've got this idea, I'm trying to be good by not taking G. It would be bad if I take it. Because G has got like a particularly bad reputation at the moment. So these are some headlines about G just from the past few months, actually. So the first one, date rape drug GHB should be reclassified as Class B, official report finds. Killer drug GHB should be reclassified, says official report. The killer chemsex drug GHB should be reclassified as a Class B drug, blah, blah, blah. So you've got G is associated with sexual assault, with rape. G is associated with death. G is associated with chemsex, and by extension with gay and bisexual men. So we're seeing this like particular stigma around G. And that is clearly playing into kind of Fuckboy's experience of of G in that particular event. And what's interesting as well is that G also gets a lot of kind of hate from within the queer community. Even it being kind of associated with queer people, it gets a lot of hate from within that community as well. You know, even from people who will happily take other illegal drugs like MDMA or cocaine, it's common for people to look down at G users. So again, that's just completely playing into fuckboy's experience in that event. So just some kind of concluding thoughts to summarize. And I hope I can remember these because I wrote them so recently. Okay, so the first point I want to make, do you know what, I'm going to have to look at my notes because I don't think I'm going to be able to remember it. Yeah, and maybe I'll just say it without, if that's cool. Yeah, what I hope I've shown with Pan's story really are the shortcomings or the limitations of thinking about capacity in a purely legal sense, and then trying to apply this to people's actual experiences of sex on drugs. And by showing how the effects of drugs emerge through events, I really hope that I've challenged the idea that intoxication is synonymous with impairment. So I'm not trying to say that drugs can never have impairing effects, but I'm more trying to say that we can't presume what the effects of drugs will be beforehand, and that we can't ignore the importance of other aspects of sex on drug events in shaping drug effects. And finally, by broadening out the concept of capacity to this more expansive idea of affective capacity, we're gaining an insight into the significance of the whole sex on drug event, the sex on drug event, you know, as a whole, which is something that we lose when we're only focusing on capacity in relation to the person or in relation to the drug that they've taken. But yeah, that is it. Thank you so much again for having me, and thank you everyone for coming and for listening. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was a lot to take in. Very fascinating, and I'm sure it's very important, especially because legal definitions around the subject are so, well, yeah, there's always so many problems in courts and stuff we can see. But anyway, I'm going to hand over to Andrea now so that she can take any questions that you might have from the audience. If you want to ask your questions in person, you know, raise your hand or indicate in the chat that you do. And Andrea will also look at some of the questions that have already been asked. And if you want to post another question, please go ahead.
Yes, so there was actually quite a bit of discussion going on during the presentation, so I'm going to try to report some of the comments and get to as many questions as we can. Also, my internet connection is on and off, so if I drop out, just shout and I will probably see it 10 minutes later. So first off, a lot of sort of criticism and discussion around the concept of incapacitation, as you know, it's been made clear it's really problematic, of how you can measure it, maybe with number of units when it comes to alcohol or something, and how concrete courts would need it in the first place. So this wishy-washy definition doesn't really work. Bamber asked about, I think you may have talked a little bit about it, about drug interactions and how it would affect progression along the scale. If a drunk person took a stimulant, they may be more alert, but actually have more drugs in their system. And so how does that, no, I don't know if you have something you want to add about that.
Do you want me to respond to that? Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point, Bamber. But I think what your point really shows is that the scale just isn't useful. Do you know what I mean? Like it's not representative of people's actual like drug experiences. Like we can't really place people on the scale. And yeah, what if they are taking multiple drugs, which is really common, you know, like in Pan's story there were many drugs that were happening, and in most of my participants' stories there were multiple drugs. So yeah, I think the main thing is how I would respond to your question. Like I don't know how it would affect progression along the scale because I don't think the scale is useful. But I think it's a really great question, and just another reason why it's so complicated to think about.
Mm-hmm. There's another interesting comment on when you were talking about what qualifies as a drug, how you're leaving it open to your participants essentially to define this. Someone pointing out about pain relief and morphine-based medication. Is that something that you've come across of people talking about that impact?
I don't know if actually, I mean, if someone was to bring it up and say it, and I would like accept that as counting as a drug. Having said that, I don't think actually any of my participants have talked about that, though I'm not like completely through with data collection. I think I don't know if I actually said this in my presentation. I did mean to, and it was in my notes to say that I'm still in the process of data collection and still in the process of analysis. So these ideas are really still very much like in formation. They're still very tentative. You know what I mean? So like I would like to take these ideas further. These are very much just my initial thoughts. But yeah, there is still space and time for pain-killing drugs and stuff like that to come up and for people to talk about, and it would be great if they did.
Pablo had a comment / question about some possible situations that become that make the issue become even more complex if the idea of incapacity is too flexible. For example, what happens if both people are incapacitated and both did not consent? Is that possible?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's such a great point as well. Like, what do you do when both people are intoxicated or incapacitated, however you're judging those? Like, whose consent matters in that situation? Often when people like make judgments about whose consent matters in those situations, they'll really fall back on kind of, you know, gendered stereotypes. Like if it's a man and woman, well, the woman's consent matters, obviously, because, you know, the man is the one who seeks consent and the woman is the one who gives consent, which obviously I disagree with, but, you know, that will often be how people deal with those kinds of situations. To be like, who was the vulnerable one then? Can we use gender to judge who the vulnerable one was? Or could we use age to judge who the vulnerable one is? Do you know what I mean? So it's not necessarily a useful way to think about it, but it is often how people do think about it in those situations. I wish I had like more of an answer to this other than I agree there are so many like other factors that can come in to make these situations even more complex, and kind of the intoxication of both people definitely being one of them.
I think Victoria has her hand up. Do you want to unmute?
Hi, Alex. Thanks so much for your presentation. It was great. I'm more thinking about the legal side of your research. Are you hoping to propose a new definition of capacity? Like what are your end goals in terms of the legal side of the research?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to state that, like, you know, my degree, my PhD is in sociology and criminology. Like I'm not saying that like I'm not interested in the law, because I am, like, clearly, you know, I've made reference to it, but my goal isn't to kind of come up with a new definition of capacity for legal purposes. Like that's not my goal. And I know it can sound like I'm being quite critical of the law, you know, in terms of how they define capacity and in terms of how they define consent as well. But it's not like I'm here saying I have a better proposal. Like I'm not saying I have anything better. So when I'm thinking about these concepts, capacity and consent, I'm trying to do it in a more sociological sense. So yeah, so maybe I'll go more in a like legal direction, but I kind of doubt it.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay. Okay, I'm unmuted. Joanna was asking an interesting question about sort of why these definitions are so vague. Are the definitions made by Dartmouth and other universities so broad because of their knowledge and want of knowledge on the matter? because there are assumptions that universities don't take sexual offenses seriously, like that case example that you shared, and even now modern cases dating to even 2020.
Yeah, I feel like the kind of advice that unis like Dartmouth are giving are really in response to that kind of criticism, because you'll find that particularly US university college campuses, they really push this idea of like affirmative consent. Like it's not enough to say no means no. Like you need a yes, you need an explicit, verbal, enthusiastic yes. And you'll see lots of campaigns, you know, like consent is sexy, consent is everything, like consent is all these things. And sometimes it feels like they're like almost putting too much on consent. Do you know what I mean? Like consent consent literally means, like we saw in the legal definition, like an agreement to have sex. Like that doesn't mean that the person also wants to have sex. Like agreeing and wanting are different things. So yeah, there's a danger of like trying to encompass too much in one small term. You know what I mean? But yeah, I can't remember exactly what the question was, but I think yes, like particularly, and the fact that the universities really frame their advice in these legal terms and like talk about it in the same kind of language that we see in things like the Sexual Offences Act and the Mental Capacity Act. I feel like that's kind of them being like, you know, responding to criticism and covering their backs maybe a little bit. I don't know.
I think there was some discussion, I don't think there's a question in here about reports of G being put in lube, so the other person doesn't even know about it. So there's several people that have seen those reports. And there was, hang on, sorry. Fiona says, I run a drugs education charity, so work primarily with teenagers up to 18. What would your advice be for them to avoid the legal as well as sexual health and ethical risks around sex on drugs? The legal lines are so blurry and it's also complicated.
Yeah, I made a video about this that's on YouTube, so I'll put it in the comments, where I kind of it maybe doesn't answer the legal question so much, but I just try and give some advice about when people are having sex and drugs, things they might keep in mind in order to keep themselves and the people around them safe. But yeah, so I'll put that in the link. I'll put that in the chat, sorry. It is there. So hopefully, oh no, that was direct to MJ, sorry. Okay. Yeah, hopefully that kind of helps a little bit. But I think there's so much more scope for more of these kinds of resources out there, and I would like to make more, but like it's also really difficult to make them, because it's just like, and I hope by the time I reach the end of my PhD, like I will have kind of more ideas for like resources like these, because there's just absolutely like a lack of them. But yeah, hopefully that kind of helps.
We have another question. What do you think are the differences between chemsex and sex on drugs?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think like less than it's made out to be. Like I absolutely think less than it's made out to be. Like I talked about this definition of what chemsex is in the presentation, you know, men who have sex with men using these drugs, in group context for an extended amount of time. But Pan's story already messed with that, because, you know, Pan isn't a cis man having sex with other men necessarily. So already that kind of messes with this official definition. They talked about they'd had cannabis in that situation as well. You know, is it not chemsex then? Do you know what, like such a rigid definition? It doesn't really make that much sense. So I mean, I always like setting chemsex aside as something so like unique and different and specific to gay and bisexual men. All it does is like, first, it kind of makes invisible the kind of sex on drugs that all groups are having, which they are. And also it just contributes to extra stigma around gay and bisexual men using sex on drugs in these contexts. So I don't think the distinction is that helpful, though I recognise having a clear term and a clear definition is very useful for attracting research funding and things like that. So it makes sense that it does have this definition in this way, but no, I don't think there are that many differences between chemsex and sex on drugs. It's very blurry.
I think I've gone through the chat, but if I've missed something, please put up your hand.
There is, yeah, someone's got their hand up. Prancer's Pepper Paws.
Yeah, sorry about the name. I referenced to the Christmas quiz and I couldn't change it. And Julia, hi Alex, thanks for your talk. It's really interesting. I was wondering, really, I mean, I really appreciate the kind of shift to kind of affective capacity. I really like that, and I really like the kind of event and environment stuff. I think that's really good. But I was wondering also, because it tends to be the case that the focus is on sort of negative stories around particularly alcohol and some of the most harmful effects of sort of chemsex or sort of drugs that are considered to be more harmful, either through actual effects or more of panics around them. And I was wondering whether there's room to kind of talk about, you know, individual drugs or specific drugs more, with, you know, in more detail, just to kind of reflect on the kind of variety of experiences that people have and actually the effects of different substances, and people reporting that maybe their awareness is heightened, or that they have a more heightened experience that is, you know, closer to consciousness or sobriety. So yeah, I was just wondering what are your thoughts on that?
I love that question so much. And if I'd have had more time, I wish I could have shared some stories of people's experiences of sex on psychedelics, because that can often be so as you've described. I can't remember exactly what this woman said who I interviewed, but she kind of said, I feel like when I have sex on acid, like I'm consenting more, like everything is more, I trust this person even more. I have the, you know, we're on this kind of wavelength that, you know, this kind of mutual psychedelic experience is giving them this kind of connection and insight into each other's kind of wants and desires. That's way more than sober sex. So one guy I interviewed talked about sex on mescaline, and he said, I think I had his thing open recently. I'll see if I can find the quote, because it was so great. Oh yes, is it? He said, the mescaline seemed to liberate me from being overly cautious while empowering my sexual accuracy. That is to say, not being cautious or careless, but kind of paradoxically on point. So just being able to tune into or tap into this, it's just kind of what you were saying, like that idea of enhancement as well. It's so present. So yeah, I can't wait to write more about sex on psychedelics and that kind of talk. I love your point so much. I hope that kind of responds to it.
Yeah, that's a great quote. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.
I think that's all of the questions, unless anyone has a really quick one for 30 seconds. Nope. Any hands? Nope, nothing.
There's one.
We have one.
You can unmute yourself.
Hello?
Hello.
Okay. No, hi. Fascinating talk. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the next one. I was just more about the data for, just to follow up on that psychedelic question. Just how much more of a problem is it? There are some drugs that are more focused on having a sexual experience, like G or something like that, where people sort of plan to have sex. Like that's sort of the intention of taking the drug. And I was just curious about what you found in your data about, like most people who take psychedelics, for example, don't really make a definite plan because you have to, it's more free flowing, right? So how does that complicate ideas of consent whenever making the plan isn't part of the plan? If you know what I mean, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it definitely does complicate consent, because a lot of people feel more comfortable about the idea of of people having sex on drugs. Like if they've talked about it first when they're sober, it's like, okay, well that kind of makes it a little bit better because they've done this consent chat, and then they've gone to do it, and then they've probably checked in again. But you know, so yeah, like losing that planned element definitely changes things. Though I would probably say I think having sex on psychedelics in a planned way was fairly common in my data. Like maybe not so much explicitly saying we're going to have sex, but more like we usually have sex when we're on psychedelics, so it's kind of expected that we will. So even when there's not a very clear plan to do it, it doesn't mean that there's no kind of expectation of it happening. But yeah, does that answer your question? Do you want, should I say more? Okay, cool.
I've Alex, check in the chat. I've put your email if that's the right email, if people have any follow-up questions for you.
Oh yeah, that is my email. Yes, that is.
Awesome. So I popped Alex's contact details in the chat if anyone has any questions as a follow-up. And thank you so much, Alex, for presenting today. It was a fantastic talk, a lot to think about. Yes, so if you have any questions, ask Alex, and we will be back after New Year's Eve we will post more events as soon as they're all, set in stone. And we look forward to seeing you after Christmas and New Year's Eve, and have a lovely, safe Christmas, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. Bye.